can start our symposium, our award symposium in honor of Dr. Kunihiko Fukushima, the Power Awardee and Laureate. My name is Bahram Nabet. I'm a professor of electrical and computer engineering at Drexel University, co-sponsor of the award from the cluster of electrical engineering of the Franklin Institute Committee on Science and the Arts is Ken Abend. Ken, would you like to, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes. Hello. My name is Ken Abend. I'm one of the two Franklin Institute sponsors for Dr. Fukushima's award. I'm an electrical engineer, retired from research in digital and statistical signal processing with applications, communications, radar, sonar pattern recognition, and microwave and ultrasound imaging. I also taught graduate school courses part-time, and I was an adjunct professor in the University of Pennsylvania Systems Engineering Department. I'd like to thank Drexel for hosting this symposium. And back to you, Bahram.
Very good. So this webinar is conducted in at least 3 time zones. Dr. Fukushima is here 13 hours ahead in Japan. We've got panelists in Europe, presenters, panelists in Europe and Eastern United States. The attendees send and we'll show written questions as possible. The Bauer Award has been awarded as one of the most prestigious in the field. Is awarded by one cluster of the 7 clusters of Committee of Science and the Arts of Franklin Institute. This committee was established in 1824 at the same time that the Franklin Institute had started. So it's the oldest. The Franklin Institute Awards is the oldest of science and technology awards in the world. Of the Franklin awardees, 121 have actually gone on and have also received Nobel Prizes. Our committee then gets to choose a topic every 7 years. Topic was neural networks and machine learning. We had, of course, a tremendous array of number of highly qualified candidates, and an international committee then had the very hard job of choosing among such brilliant candidates the laureate, the awardee. The program today has been distributed, and we would like to start the program with a message from the Franklin Institute.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Daryl Williams, Senior Vice President of Science and Education at the Franklin Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Institute to this special program honoring Kunihiko Fukushima, recipient of the 2021 Bauer Award and Prize for Achievement in Science under the theme Neural Networks for Machine Learning. We are proud to induct Dr. Fukushima into the legacy of the Franklin Institute Awards. Since 1824, we have honored more than 2,000 scientists, engineers, innovators, and entrepreneurs for the most groundbreaking achievements of the past 2 centuries. Our laureates have truly changed the world with their remarkable work, and Dr. Fukushima is no exception. Typically, every spring, our newest class of laureates gathers in Philadelphia to participate in a week-long celebration of their achievements. During this time, they engage learners of all ages and levels in a broad range of educational experiences that best represent the Institute's mission to inspire passion for learning about science and technology. But as you know, this isn't a typical time. This year, we had the opportunity to engage in even more people from around the world by hosting our program online, including this wonderful tribute to Dr. Fukushima. I'd like to thank Drexel University for hosting us today and the University of Pennsylvania for their sponsorship. Drexel and Penn have been wonderful, longtime partners of the Franklin Institute in so many exciting initiatives, and we are grateful to them for making this program possible. And I would also like to thank Dr. Ken Abend and Professor Barham Nevid, who are Dr. Fukushima's laureate sponsors. They are members of the Franklin Institute's Committee on Science and the Arts and the chairs of the Bauer Pre-Selection Committee, who championed the theme of neural networks for machine learning and were instrumental in the selection of Dr. Fukushima for this Bauer Award. The Bauer Award and Prize for Achievement in Science, with its gold medal and $250,000 cash prize, was established in 1988 by a bequest from Henry Bauer, a Philadelphia chemical manufacturer and grandson of a 19th century Franklin Institute laureate. This award is different from the Franklin Institute's other awards, and that awardees are selected through a purely external global nomination process. The finalists advance to the Bauer International Selection Committee, a panel of experts in the chosen field, which makes the final selection. I'd like to thank all of those who served on these selection committees for their efforts and for their excellent choice of Dr. Fukushima. Dr. Fukushima's award, along with the Benjamin Franklin Medals, the Bauer Business Award for Business Leadership, and the inaugural Benjamin Franklin NextGen Award, will be presented during our virtual awards ceremony tonight, April 29th at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Details on how you can view the ceremony are on our website, www.fi.edu. I hope you will join us then. On behalf of the Franklin Institute, congratulations to Dr. Fukushima, and thank you all for joining us today. I would now like to share a short video that encapsulates the rich history of the Franklin Institute's awards and shows some of the giants that Dr. Fukushima joins as a new Franklin Institute laureate. Following this, please stay tuned for a video profile of Dr. Fukushima himself.
When, in the course of human events, a spark of inspiration sets the world ablaze with the fires of enlightenment and puts us firmly afoot on the way of progress, connecting us to one another in ways that elevate all of humankind to equal stations from which to pursue understanding. A decent respect for innovation requires that we recognize those who so affect our receding horizons, using only that to which the laws of nature entitle them, and declare that these inspired few are the architects of our future, and their insights the foundation upon which humankind distinguishes itself from all others. And with this, we hold that truth is not always self-evident, that it sometimes lies deep below the surface, and that the deserving are those who dare to seek it there. and then return to spread the word and say that with a single moment of inspiration, we have truly moved forward. This is our declaration of progress, a legacy spanning nearly 2 centuries. The Franklin Institute Awards, the spirit of independence, emanates from Philadelphia.
In the late 1970s, Kunihiko Fukushima sketches out an algorithm. It's a solution to a computing problem that, in some ways, won't become practically relevant for another 40 years. But Fukushima knows he's onto something. When computers catch up, the schematics on his desk will help move artificial intelligence from the domain of fantasy to reality. After years of studying the human visual cortex, Fukushima has created a way for machines to do what we do best: to see the world, recognize patterns, and learn. Japanese-born Fukushima began his engineering career at 10 years old, leaving the island of Taiwan for Japan when the island fell out of Japanese control after World War II.
We are not allowed to bring anything except one baggage for each person. So because I didn't have anything with me, I didn't have any toy. So my uncle gave me transformer and electric motor, which he was trying to make when he was young.
Fukushima taught himself the fundamentals of electrical engineering from old textbooks, finished the electric motor, and by junior high school was building radios in his home. In a sense, from then on, Fukushima was always thinking about the future of visual and auditory technology. For instance, he'd earned his PhD from Kyoto University after devising a method for broadcasting 3D television signals. This was in 1966. But it wasn't until he joined NHK, the Japan Broadcasting Corporation, that Fukushima stopped asking how machines could transmit audiovisual signals, wondering instead whether computers could receive them and, more importantly, make sense of what they heard and saw. Fukushima wanted to make a computer that worked like the human brain.
Recognizing images and patterns comes so easily to us that we rarely stop to think about how complex it is. Take the letter A, for example. It looks something like this, right? Or does it look like this? Or this? How about this? Your brain recognizes the letter A consistently, even though chances are you're looking at versions you've never encountered before. Fukushima understood that a pattern-recognizing machine would have to work like the brain. It would have to learn the concept of a given image, like the version of letter A you imagined a moment ago, and compare this conceptual understanding to real-world observations.
At first, we didn't know anything about neurophysiology, neuropsychology. So we called some professors of neurophysiology to our lab, and they gave me a lecture for about 1 or 2 years.
Fukushima learned all he could about the brain's visual cortex, where cells were arranged into a neural network, a kind of circuitry completely different from the electronics Fukushima found familiar. But he soon realized this new kind of wiring was perfect for pattern recognition. Fukushima sketched up a network of electronic cells arranged in layers. A camera would feed an image into the cells. Layer by layer, the cells would analyze curvature and angles, the size and position of the lines, all the while comparing it to a single memorized concept of the target. In 1979, Fukushima called his revolutionary new machine the Neocognitron. And with the help of NHK, he produced this quintessentially 1980s film showing off its pattern recognizing capabilities. After his initial discovery, Fukushima and others spent years improving the Neocognitron, giving it the ability to recognize sounds, videos, and even obstructed imagery, sometimes more capably than the human brain. Recognize any of these letters? Believe it or not, it's not a problem for newer versions of the Neocognitron. As modern computers became smaller and faster, Fukushima's discovery became a core feature of modern artificial intelligence systems. Today, Neocognitron technology gives industrial robots visual abilities. Braking and steering systems for self-driving cars. It can identify cancer under a microscope as reliably as a trained specialist. and even recognize patterns in nature that point to coming natural disasters. Fukushima's 1979 Neocognitron, decades ahead of its time, is just now entering its prime. As time goes on and artificial intelligence systems continue to redefine the role machines play in our daily lives, the Neocognitron and its inventor will continue to hold a place in our cars, our pockets, and everywhere the great discovery story of humankind is told.
Okay. This video is typically shown at the awards night for the very first time. The awards night is also virtual tomorrow. So we are very glad that we were able to see the video, be able to play it out for this session. At this point, Ken Abend would you please introduce the laureate for his talk?
I've been yes. To quote a former Franklin Institute laureate, Thomas Edison, until a man duplicates a blade of grass, nature can laugh at his so-called scientific knowledge. While we still haven't duplicated grass, today we honor Dr. Fukushima for showing us a way to simulate part of a brain. Our first speaker today from Tokyo is our Garro laureate, Dr. Kunihiko Fukushima.
The Neocognitron is an artificial neural network that can recognize visual patterns robustly. It has the architecture of deep convolutional neural network, namely deep CNN. As you know, deep CNNs are widely used in many areas of artificial intelligence. It was 1979 when I first proposed the Neocognitron. I think the Neocognitron is now recognized as one of the origins of deep CNNs. Although it has a long history, the development and improvement of the Neocognitron are still continuing. I'd like to start my talk from the history of the Neocognitron and then discuss recent advances of the Neocognitron, focusing on the differences from recent CNNs. Now I talk how I got the idea of the Neocognitron. In 1960s, neurophysiologists Huber and Widrow observed the response of cells in the primary cortex of cat or monkey. And they proposed the hypothesis that in the visual cortex, there are several types of cells, simple cells, complex cells, and hypercomplex cells, and they are connected in a hierarchical manner. I was interested in the hypothesis by Huber and Widrow and wanted to make a neural network model. It has the simple cells, complex cells, and hypercomplex cells. If an input pattern like this is presented to the input layer, the cell in the deepest layer responds like this. Where the input pattern is straight, there's no response. Only the place where the input pattern is curved, we have a large response. This network already had the architecture of this CNN, but it didn't have the ability of learning. In 1960s, three-layered perceptron was very popular. It had three-layered network, and the cell in the deepest layer has flexible input connections. It can be trained to recognize patterns by supervised learning. Although many people thought that the ability of the perceptron would be increased if the layer of the network is increased, but no method for training the multi-layer network was not known at that time. Backpropagation had not been known in 1960s. I then proposed to use competitive learning for training multi-layered neural network. The network is named Cognitron. It has many layers of cells, and the training is done by unsupervised learning. When training stimulus 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 are repeatedly presented to the network, the cell in the deeper layer come to respond selectively one of the training pattern. For example, these are cells which respond pattern 4, and this cell, for example, have a small receptive field and extract local features of pattern 4. And this cell has a little bit larger receptive field and extract more larger area of pattern 4. And the cell in the deep layer responds selectively to one of the training patterns, in this case pattern 4. Although the Neocognitron can be trained by unsupervised learning, it didn't accept the shift of input patterns. So the next goal was to find out the training method for networks that accept information. For example, training CNN. The curvature extracting network I just showed you already had the architecture of CNN. We got a hint from the regeneration of connections between retina and optic tectum. The lower animals, such as frog or fish, the optic tectum is the visual center. And from retina to the optic tectum, there are continuous connections, keeping the topology of the position of retina in the retina. And even if the optic nerve is cut, it's regenerated and restore the same connections as before. If at the time of cutting the optic nerve, if half of the tectum is removed, then the whole retina come to connect to the whole or half tectum, keeping the topology. I then proposed to use seed cells to train convolutional neural network. The seed cell works like a seed in crystal growth, and all the other cells in its vicinity follow the seed cell and change their input connections. I then proposed a neural network that consists of S cells and C cells. S cells resemble simple cells, and C cells resemble complex cells. And the two layers consisting of S cells and C cells make a module, and this module is connected in a cascade in a hierarchical manner. This is the architecture of the Neocognitron, and it has layers of S cells, which make the feature extraction, and the layer of C cells, which make a pooling operation. And in the deep layer, we make the classification of input patterns. And each layer of the network is divided into sub-layers, which we call cell plane. And the connection between cell plane is like this, and all the cells in a cell plane share the same set of connections, and it makes the operation of spatial filtering or convolution. Well, how the robust pattern recognition can be made by this Neocognitron? The Neocognitron has many layers of cells, and the cells in the lower layer observe with a small receptive field some local features of input pattern. And this cell respond to this local feature. And the cell in the next stage receive the response of the preceding stage. And if this cell, for example, if these three cells are active, then this cell will become active. And so we can say that the cell in this layer extract global features of input pattern. And the cell in the deepest layer observe the response of these cells And if these three local features exist, this cell comes to respond. So we can say that this cell indirectly observes the whole input image. Well, now we look at what is done by the S cells and C cells. And this is the connection from S cell to C cell. Each C cell receives input connections from S cells which extract the same feature but slightly different from slightly different locations. If the input pattern like this is presented, this cell will respond to the lambda-shaped feature of training pattern A. And if this output is sent to this C cell, and if the input pattern shifts like this, another cell comes to respond, but still this C cell keep responding. And even if the input pattern shifts like this cell keep responding. So now we will look at the response of the cell in the next stage. This cell is trained to recognize this combination of training patterns or the response of preceding layer. And this is the cell, and this is the training pattern. And after that, if the pattern like this is presented, still this cell keep responding because this feature is extracted by S cells, and by the function of C cells, the positional shift, small amount of positional shift is accepted by the function of complex cells, C cells. And the same is true for this feature, and this also for this feature. So even if the shift input pattern is diminished like this, still the same as S cell keep responding. So the S cell can respond robustly to the deformed and learned deformed pattern like this. Well, we'll show how to train the S cell during the learning stage. These cells, and during the learning, we propose to use other silent rule. Well, in the other silent rule, when the cells are silent in spite of the active input, then we propose to generate new cell like this. And the connection to the generated cell is proportional to the intensity of the stimulus pattern. In this case, this is a strong response. So we have a strong connection from this and a small connection with this. We'll show how the learning progress under the other silent rule. The learning starts from the state where there is no cell. At time t equals 0, this training stimulus is presented. Then, since in the initial state no cell exists, so it's silent. So a new cell is generated here. And at time t equals 1, another training pattern is presented. And if this cell, which was generated at time t equals 0, is silent, then another cell is generated, and its input connection is made to be proportional to the intensity of the stimulus pattern. And at t equals 2, if one of the existing cells is respond to the input stimulus, then this training stimulus is just ignored and nothing happens. We continue this process repeatedly. And look at the number of cells in each layer. In the recent Neocognitron, which we use as a silent rule, the cells are generated during the learning when needed. It's in contrast to the conventional deep CNNs. In the deep CNNs, the number of cells is fixed. During the learning, it's the connection between cells that are modified. We now look at the process of pattern recognition in the deepest layer. We use the interpreting vector. Well, we assume that the training of the intermediate layer has already been finished, and we observe only the response of the deepest layer, where all the training stimulus has already been converted to vectors. So we consider the response of the cells in the deepest layer in the vector space. From the large set of training stimulus, we choose a small number of reference vectors, which represent the whole set of training patterns. And since the deepest layer, we use supervised learning, so each reference vector has a label to each class it belongs. So we have reference vector of class A and reference vector of class B. Here we propose to define a virtual vector, which we call interpreting vector. It's a vector made by a linear combination of two reference vectors of the same label. It's given by this equation. So we can say that the interpreting vector distributes along this line and the number of interpreted vectors is infinite. And if we use winner-take-all, when test vector is presented here, we search the nearest reference vector. And in this case, this is the nearest vector, and it has a label of B. So this pattern is recognized as B by winner-take-all. However, when we use interpreting vector, we search the nearest reference vector. And in this case, this is the nearest reference vector. And since the reference vectors distribute around the line connecting the reference vector of the same label, so we can say that this is the process of searching the nearest line. We now show how the patterns are recognized using this interpreting vector. This is the distribution of patterns in the vector space. If this test pattern is presented, the nearest reference vector is here. So it's recognized as 9 by winner-take-all. However, if we use the interpreting vector, this interpreting vector is the nearest to 7. So this is made by the linear combination of these two reference vectors. So this pattern is recognized as 7 by the use of interpreting vector. And this is some examples how the patterns are recognized by interpreting vector. If we use winner-take-all, this pattern is recognized as 8, but if we use interpreting vector, this is recognized as 2. This is another example. This is recognized as 0 by winner-take-all, but if we use interpreting vector, this is recognized as the pattern in between these two patterns. And we'd like to look at what kind of operation we make by the interpreting vector. These two are the reference vectors of pattern 4, and this is a sequence of deformed patterns between these two reference vectors. And in the interpreting vector, we make you use the linear interpolation and make the sequence of deformed patterns like this. If we apply this to the directly to the input image, the accuracy of emulation is not high. But in the interpreting vector, we apply this operation not directly to input image, but to extracted features. If we apply this operation to extracted features, then the accuracy of emulation becomes very high. Why interpreting vector is powerful? In the conventional CNNs, we use some technique we call data augmentation. The recognition error by CNN can be reduced by increasing the number of training patterns. If a large set of training patterns is not available, artificially generated training patterns are added to cover the shortage. Interpreting vector makes the data augmentation not during the training phase, but during the recognition phase. So the number of features can virtually be increased without increasing the set of training patterns. We now propose to use interpreting vector from not 2, but from 3 or 4 or reference vectors. In the case of int3, where we use the interpreting vector from 3 reference vectors, in this case, we sort the nearest plane. In the case of int4, we sort the nearest hyperplane. And this is an example of the computer simulation. This vertical axis shows the recognition error by the use of interpreting vector. If you use winner take all, which correspond to int1, then the recognition error is like this. If you use int4, the recognition error can be reduced like this. And the horizontal axis shows the number of reference vectors chosen during the training. And for your reference, I show the error by SVM, support vector machine. And we can see that the recognition error can be much reduced by the use of interpreting vector. And it's interesting to see that the interpreting vector, even under the interpreting vector, there's a small tendency, some tendency of overfitting. And the best recognition rate is obtained around here. And it is interesting to see that the number of reference vectors which give the best recognition rate for int4 is almost the same as the number of support vectors selected by SVM. Now we show some example of the network which is extended from the Neocognitron. Look at these patterns. I think you have difficulty in recognizing what they are. How about this? I think you can easily recognize what they are. They are occluded by gray object. Alphabetical characters are occluded by gray object. But if the occluding object is not seen, it becomes difficult to recognize what they are. We now look at the patterns are easier to recognize when occluding objects are visible. The input pattern has many local features in it, and if the input pattern is occluded by some other object, then the features which are relevant to the original pattern are occluded. And at the same time, irrelevant features are generated by partial occlusion. And the visual system is disturbed by relevant features, although it's tolerant for partial absence of relevant features. So in the network of Neocognitron, I propose to use a mask layer which responds to the occluding object and inhibit the relevant features. This is the architecture of the network, and this is a mask layer added to the Neocognitron type network. If this pattern is presented, it's recognized as I when the occluding object is not visible. If the occluding object is visible, it's recognized as A. It coincides with the natural feeding. And look at this pattern. You might feel that the pattern B is partially occluded by gray object. How about this? You might feel that R is occluded. If you compare these two patterns, the black part does not change. Only the placement of gray object changes between the two. And if we present this pattern to the Neocognitron with Pascal layer, then this pattern is recognized as R, and this pattern is recognized as B. It coincides with our natural feeding. Well, I'll show another example of the extended network from the Neocognitron, the selective attention model, in which we introduce the backward signal path. And this is the Neocognitron type network, and we duplicate it in this part. And they are identical, but only the direction of signal flow is reversed. So in the Neocognitron type network, the signal flows in bottom-up directions, and in the selective attention model, the signal flow in the top-down direction. And there are interactions between cells in the feed forward and feedback passes. And you might feel that this resembles UNet, but the different from UNet, in a selective attention model, the interaction between the bottom-up and top-down paths are bidirectional. I'll show only that example of the response. If we show this combination of two patterns to the Neocognitron of selective attention model, it focuses the attention to the left part and recognizes that it's as two and segmented from the rest. After switching attention, it focuses its attention around here, and it recognizes as 3, and the pattern 3 is segmented. This is another example. Even if identical patterns are presented in parallel, it focuses attention to one of them, in this case the left part of the 22, and it recognizes 2 here, and then after switching attention, it recognizes another 2 in the right part. And so we can recognize these patterns sequentially by changing the selective attention. And if this pattern is presented, this pattern is first recognized as 4, and after switching attention, this 2 is recognized and segmented, and after switching attention again, 1 is recognized and segmented. Well, this is almost the end of my talk. I'd like to look at the history of artificial neural networks. It repeats the boom and the winter age repeatedly, and we are now in the third boom. What's the next? In order to prevent entering into the winter age again, I think it's important to learn from the biological brain and find out the basic principles that control the brain. In order to learn from the brain, neural network model plays an important role, and it gives design principles for brain-like AI, and at the same time, the AI become a powerful tool for analyzing the brain. In Japan, we have a common saying, listen to 1, understand 10. The original meaning of the saying is, 1 word is enough to the wise. If we express the present AI, we can say, listen to billions, understand millions. One of the future goals of AI is listen to thousands, understand billions. I expect further progress of AI, including deep neural networks. Thank you for your kind attention.
Yes. Thank you so much, Fukushima-san.
Thank you very much for listening to my talk.
This is, we do have a bit of time, since Dr. Fukushima is here, to answer any questions that you might have. I don't see any answers, any questions.
There's a raised hand by Rosina Weber.
Okay.
She can unmute and ask.
She can unmute.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if attendees can do that.
Yes, I was given, thank you. I was given the option to unmute. Dr. Fukushima, thank you so much for your talk. I'm Rosina Weber from Drexel University. It's very enlightening to see this beautiful body of work you've done. I have seen lots of interest and parallels of research between with neural networks with images and also with text, like embeddings for images, like we use embeddings for text. What are your thoughts about how your work can be used in text data, textual data? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last part of your question.
How do you think that we can use your work when we apply to textual data?
You mean apply to character data?
Text, to natural language text?
Uh-huh.
Following the parallels when we build neural networks for text, the use of embeddings that we learn, and how we are able to produce computations computing those embeddings. And there is a lot of work now trying to produce embeddings for images. What are your thoughts about that line of work?
I'm sorry, I couldn't catch your point here.
If I may interject, can you send that written question to Dr. Fukushima and he can answer?
Thank you. Thank you.
That would be. Okay. So
there's another raised hand.
There's also a question in the Q&A.
yes, the Q&A that I created. There's a question in.
Hello. Excuse me. My name is Hector, and I'm a father of the company Admet Evolution. And actually, my company mission is, accelerate humanity intellectual evolution in AI's age, because I think, just because, AI has been rising at, rapid rate. So I think that's kind of, a dangerous signal to, our survival in the futures. So, and one of the things that I'm trying to solve in my project is that because I want I know that Fukushima his work kind of like one direction, but I'm thinking kind of opposite direction. How can we recognize our images in our neural network and we bring out to life and that's how I think that's gonna help people accelerate their learning in the futures a lot, because I think that's how Albert Einstein used their his imagination and images to accelerate his learning. So I'm gonna use that method to accelerate humanity intellectual evolution. So I want to ask Mr. Fukushima, how can we recognize our images in our neural network and bring back to life?
Okay. So let me interject. I think I would request that could you please send your questions, since we are also a bit short of time here. Could you please send your questions, written questions, and I will convey that to Dr. Fukushima so that he could read and answer them more concisely. So with that, let's go to the next step of our program. Next, Professor Professor Bernard Widrow is known to the community and to the world for his work on LMS algorithm, and also for his work on neural networks. This Bauer Award was to be the symposium, and the award was scheduled for April of 2020 last year, and of course it had to be rescheduled. Professor Widrow was asked to present, and his preference has been not to do a formal presentation. As he writes, he said that I'm not I cannot make astute comments about Neocognitron, but of course I've known Kunihiko Fukushima for many, many years. So here is his presentation is a personal recollection and a note of congratulation to Dr. Fukushima that we will be playing. Well, Dr. Widrow received his MIT in 1956. He was elected fellow of IEEE in 1976, got the Alexander Graham Bell Medal in 1986, and a Neural Networks Pioneer Award in 1991. He was inducted into the National Academy of Engineering in 1995, and he actually received the Benjamin Franklin Medal for Electrical Engineering from Franklin Institute in 2001, 20 years ago. And in fact, Ken Abend was the sponsor of Dr. Widrow. So here is what Dr. Widrow would like to tell you, Dr. Fukushima, and of course the audience.
The floor is mine. If I have so much stature, I feel like a statue. I'm going to get stiff. Anyhow, thank you for the kind introduction, Barm. And I'd like to begin by congratulating Kunihiko, an old friend. He and I came to know each other at the time of the founding of the International Neural Network Society. And I have my notes here. The society was founded in 1988. So I've known him since 1988. And I just think it's wonderful that he's the recipient of this fine award and nice prize. It's enough to retire and buy a house. And in any event, Kunihiko, I can't see you, but I think you can probably see me. So I wish you all the best and congratulations once again. Now, I'll tell a little bit of story of some of the history of some of this. I'll tell you about the founding of the INNS by Stephen Grossberg. He called me one day. I didn't know him at the time. Now I know him. And he said he wants to found a society and create a journal. And I tried to persuade him not to do that because I said the IEEE is already holding big meetings and the IEEE has transactions that can cover this field of neural networks. No, he just insisted, and I knew there was no way I could persuade him. And so he asked me if I would join the board. I said, okay. In other words, you fight it to a certain extent, then you join it. In any event, I was on the original board, and I think Kunihiko was also on the original board, and that's how we got to know each other. So it's been a long time. We haven't seen each other for a long time. So I just wish to express my happiness with your great success, your great career, everything you've done. Wonderful. In any event, let's go back 33 years ago at the founding. At that time, there were a few people all over the world researching neural networks. For example, at MIT, there were McCullough and Pitts. It was myself with Adeline and Madeline at Stanford. It was you in Japan, the Neocognitron, John Hopfield at Caltech with recurrent networks, Steve Grossberg and Gail Carpenter at Boston University with ART, Terry Sinofsky with Boltzmann machine, Bart Costco at USC, Nagumo and Noda in Tokyo, Cayanello in Italy, Gabor in England. Gabor was the inventor of holography, for which he got a Nobel Prize. Eisenman in Moscow, and there are many others at that time. The way I looked at it, it was sort of a paradigm horse race. Which of the paradigms will survive? Kunihiko, you are a winner. I guess I'm a winner also. We're both winners. How do you like that? Well, I'll tell you, I'm not sure of all the people who will be watching this. Many of you would know me, but some of you don't. And so I'll tell you a little bit about my own history and a little bit about current research. I first became involved with this after attending a meeting that was held in 1956 at Dartmouth College. It's a famous workshop on not neural networks, AI. It was held at Dartmouth College, and the founders of AI were all there. They were all talking about artificial intelligence. And about a few months before that, I just completed my doctoral thesis at MIT on the subject of quantization noise. This is Randolph error that occurs in all digital computation. And I attended that conference. With a colleague, I spent a week there. The conference was going on all summer. You can interrupt, you can raise your hand and say something. You can just sit there. You can come and go as you like. It was a very flexible group of people. So we stayed there for a whole week. When I left, my mind was throbbing. But what it was the people are talking about building a machine that thinks. And I've never got over it. So I went back to MIT, where I had just joined the faculty, and I spent about 6 months thinking about thinking. And I think I figured out how it works. I still hold the same ideas today. It turns out that some time later, I attended a seminar at MIT given by Arthur Samuel. And his checker playing program, he wrote up in a paper in MIT Technology Review, and he called it machine learning. That was the first use of the words machine learning. And he really did machine learning. This was, in my opinion, some of the best piece of work in AI that was ever done. Was done in the late 1957s, early 1950s, late 1950s and early 1960s, done by Arthur Samuel. So anyhow, I began thinking about thinking, and I realized it's going to take years before we can build anything that thinks with the technology that we had at the moment. And I decided that I can't leave this subject. It's like a monkey on my back. I can't get it out of my system. What can I do? Well, my thesis work was in the area of what you call today digital signal processing, and also digital control systems. And so I knew all about digital filters. So I came up with the idea of taking a digital filter whose parameters could be adjusted automatically to let it self-optimize. In other words, let the filter learn and improve itself to be a better filter. And so I adapted an adaptive algorithm. I found out that the mean square error, which is what I was minimizing in accord with Wiener theory, I was minimizing mean square error. In minimizing mean square error, I realized that the mean square error was a quadratic function of the coefficients of the filter. Therefore, what you have is you're trying to minimize mean square error. You have a quadratic bowl. If you have many weights, you're in hyperspace, so you have a hyperparaboloid, and it has a unique optimum. And what I thought to do is, like a ball rolling down the hill, use gradient. And I was taking derivatives one parameter at a time by moving the parameter forward and backward and seeing the differences in the measured mean square error. And what I was doing was using a stochastic gradient to go down the sides of the bowl, to go down to the minimum, where what I call the Wiener solution. It was the best linear least squares optimal filter. We were doing this at MIT back in 1956. We were making adaptive filters. Today, the internet will not work without adaptive filters. Your cell phone will not work without adaptive filters. So this was kind of the beginning of what I call adaptive signal processing. In any event, the procedure was tedious. We were doing this, we were simulating it on an IBM mainframe. I think it was an IBM 704. That was MIT's computer. And in 1959, I left MIT and came to Stanford. While I was still at MIT, there was a student that came to me, master's student, named Dick Matson, M-A-T-T-S-O-N. And he had the idea of using a neural-like element in the fashion of McCullough and Pitts, and trying to do computer logic with it. And it turns out the logic that he was trying to do today is known as linearly separable logic functions. And so he got me interested in a neural element. I was interested in learning with it. He was interested in doing logic with it. So there was a slight disconnect, but he was my student. And that's what got me into working with neurons. I realized that the neuron has a linear combiner and an activation function. And the adaptive filter has a linear combiner without the nonlinear activation function. So we were adapting neurons, we were adapting digital filters, but the adaptive process was the same. Well, I came in 1959, left MIT and came to Stanford, which turns out to be a fortuitous thing. My first PhD student at Stanford was a man named Ted Hoff, who became very famous in Silicon Valley, but different, not exactly for the work he did with me, but the work he did after when he went to work at Intel. Well, I was explaining to him about how you take derivatives and stochastic gradient and all this stuff. And somehow I was up at the blackboard explaining it, and we were having a discussion, and out of the discussion came a different way of getting the gradient. And we can get all components of the gradient simultaneously without differentiating, without squaring anything. We get it directly from the input data. And that algorithm, we didn't have a name for it at the time, but subsequently my students gave it the name LMS, which means least mean square. So the two of us were the inventors of LMS algorithm. And when I wrote it out on the blackboard, I just knew in my insides, my guts, that this is really a profound thing. I thought that we had discovered the secret of life. It was that big of a deal in my mind. Within a half hour, Hoff had it operating, running on an analog computer across the hall from my office. That weekend, the two of us built our first Adeline. It's a neuron that is adapted with the LMS algorithm. And we bought all the parts and we built it over a weekend. And on Monday morning, I had this thing on my desk and I can demonstrate a learning machine. Remember, this is 1959. And we had a learning machine. You can actually train it. It's a trainable circuit, hardware. And this went on. We began to work more on adaptive filters and beginnings of neural networks. And so this went on and on. And after a while, I became more focused on adaptive filters because they were simpler. They didn't have the nonlinear activation function. So you're able to treat the adaptive filters analytically, which you couldn't do very well with neural networks, where you have a network of neurons that each neural element is a nonlinear device. And that doesn't lend itself to mathematics very well. So I was very hesitant about having students do doctoral research in that field because I was afraid that all their work was empirical, and there was not a good analytic basis for it, except for the linear combiner. But if you try to combine this in a network, you've got nonlinearity everywhere. So this is a bugger. And we never succeeded in adapting multi-layers. My first exposure to an algorithm that I was hoping to develop but never did was at a meeting, I think it was 1985 at Snowbird. And everybody was there, except I don't think Grossberg was there, but John Hopfield was there. And David Rummelhart was there. And Rummelhart and McClellan had already written the two books. I forgot the name of those books, but they made backprop very famous. And everybody was talking about backprop. So when they started this conference at Snowbird, the people were meeting, having a conference starting at 8 o'clock in the morning until noontime. Then we stopped, everybody had lunch together. After lunch, everybody went skiing because Snowbird is a mountain resort near Salt Lake City, Utah. Beautiful place, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. So they would go skiing in the afternoon. I would go out and take a nice long walk and look at the snow and the beauty of everything. And then at 6 o'clock, everybody would meet back together. We'd all have dinner together. And after dinner, the sessions would begin again and it would last until midnight. So we had 2 daily sessions with skiing in between. And don't forget lunch and dinner. In any event, I I was exposed to the backprop algorithm, and I was so inspired, I figured out how to do Madeline, a form of Madeline that would do multi-layers, both adaptive layers, on the way back on the airplane. And we took it back to Stanford and tried it out, and we got it all working. And so that was something, we just didn't make a big fuss about it. Backprop seemed like a good algorithm. It still is. Backprop is really the basis of artificial intelligence today. The most popular neural network algorithm perhaps is convolutional networks, which is based on your work, Kunihiko. So it looks like you and I were winners of the horse race. Which algorithms are going to survive? The others are still there. They're probably still valid, but I don't know that they're getting a lot of attention like they might. But the LMS algorithm turns out to be, among adaptive algorithms, is the most widely used on the planet. It turns out that every modem in the world uses some form of LMS algorithm. It's used for echo canceling. Every digital communication channel, whether it's wireless, whether it's cable, whether it's telephone line, whether it's fiber optic, whatever it is, the digital channel has the problem of reflections, of waves traveling in the channel, and the reflections screw up digital communication. So you have to have some way to stop the echo. And they do this with adaptive filters that are called echo cancelers. The other thing is that the channels are very irregular. They have frequency responses with peaks and dips. That also interferes with the ability to transmit and receive digital data. So you have to have what's called equalization. So this is a filter at the receiving end whose transfer function is the reciprocal of the transfer function of the channel. But you don't know what the channel is, so you have to have an adaptive filter that can adapt to signals in the channel, adapt itself to the channel to equalize it. The echo canceller also has to adapt to the channel because every channel is different, no two alike. So you have to have adaptive filters to do equalization and echo canceling, otherwise you can't do digital transmission. Or if you do it, it has to be at such a slow rate that there wouldn't be any internet. So how do you like that story? Anyhow, Kunihiko, good friend, congratulations, enjoy, and be good.
Thank you very much.
Right. Yes, this seminar, this symposium is in fact history as told by those who made it. And I should also add that Bernie Widrow continues to be active. He has been working for the past 10 years, interested in a combination of Hebbian LMS algorithm together that has written a book on this subject by the title of Cybernetics 2.0, or working on a book that's almost complete, Cybernetics 2.0. The next speaker is going to be Joachim Schmidhuber, and is going to be introduced by Ken Abend.
Could I have my video? To give you an appraisal, oops, sorry, start my video.
Yes, there you go.
Yeah. To give you an appraisal of Dr. Fukushima's work, I'm proud to introduce a man responsible for your phone understanding your speech and predicting the next word you are going to type. Dr. Schmidt-Hooper's deep learning artificial neural networks include recursion or feedback described by the oxymoron label long short-term memory. By 2015 to 2017, they were on over 3 billion smartphones and used billions of times per day. For example, for Facebook's automatic translation, Google's and Microsoft's speech recognition, Google Translate, Apple's Siri and QuickType, and Amazon's Alexa. He is chief scientist of the company NNAI Sense, which aims at building the first practical general purpose artificial intelligence. Ladies and gentlemen, from Switzerland, Dr. Eugen Schmidt-Huber.
I am Jürgen Schmidt-Huber. Here you see how to pronounce my name. I drew that robot cartoon in 2006. There is no doubt that Dr. Kunihiko Fukushima totally deserves the 2020 Bauer Award due to his enormous contributions to artificial neural networks and deep learning. In the 1970s, he created the now popular deep convolutional neural network architecture, the CNN architecture as it is often called now, which consists of alternating convolution layers and downsampling layers, convolutional layers and so on. And he called it the Neocognitron. It was first published in 1979 in Japanese and then in English in 1980. And here you see a modern variant of this architecture from one of our own later papers. Kunihiko Fukushima's deep neural network was inspired by Hubel and Wiesel's neurophysiological studies. Back then, biological neural networks were still an inspiration to artificial neural networks. This is not any longer the case. For decades, the field of deep neural nets has been driven by engineering and by simple mathematics without much regard for biological plausibility. Deep learning, of course, started in 1965 in the Soviet Union, more precisely in the Ukraine, with Ivagnenko and Lapa, who had the first deep learning multi-layer perceptrons that really worked with many layers. And they also did not care for neuroscience. They were mathematicians. In the early 1970s, Ivagnenko already had deep learning nets with 8 layers, something that would be called deep even in the new millennium. Kunihiko Fukushima's Neocognitron was introduced at the end of the 1970s, which were a special decade for deep learning. And it is playing a very prominent role in this history of deep learning. Today, everybody is using variants of this CNN architecture for computer vision and other applications. How does it work? The typically rectangular receptive field of a neural unit, a neuron with a given weight vector, a so-called filter, is shifted step by step across a two-dimensional array of input values such as the pixels of an image. Usually there are several such filters, And the resulting array of subsequent activations of this unit can then provide inputs to higher level units and so on. Due to massive weight replication, relatively few parameters may be necessary to describe the behavior of such a convolutional layer, which typically feeds a so-called downsampling layer consisting of units whose fixed weight connections originate from physical neighbors in the convolutional layer below. And Kunihiko Fukushima's downsampling units use something called spatial averaging to become active if at least one of their inputs is active. And their responses are insensitive to certain small image shifts. Now, interestingly, the backpropagation algorithm was already well known when Kunihiko Fukushima did his work in the late 1970s, but he did not use backpropagation to train his convolutional architecture. Instead, he used unsupervised learning rules. Today, however, his architecture is indeed trained by modern backpropagation, which was published in 1970 by Seppo Linna-Inma in Finland, and first applied to neural networks by Paul Werbers in 1982, extending thoughts in his 1974 thesis. And backpropagation is also known as the reverse mode of automatic differentiation. In 1987, neural nets with convolutions were combined by Alex Weibel with backpropagation and with weight sharing. Alex Weibel neither called this neocognitrons nor CNNs, but he called it TDNNs. He successfully applied them to speech recognition. Interestingly, Alex Weibel did this work also in Japan, like Fukushima, but he was working in a different lab. I was wondering, why is it that the basic concepts of modern deep CNNs emerged in Japan, of all places, between 1979 and 1987? Let's look back at the 1980s. Back then, Japan was the envy of the world. Among the large nations, it was the richest per capita. I was a young man back then, and I remember that 8 of the top 10 banks in the world were Japanese. And the Tokyo stock market was the world's largest, and the central square mile of Tokyo, had the value of California. And before the big crash, at the end of the 1980s, Japan was growing so quickly that many predicted that by 2005, it would have the world's biggest economy, despite having only 120 million people or so. Also, Japan soon had far more robots than any other nation. In fact, at some point, half of the robots of the world were based in Japan. And they also had by far the most expensive computer science and artificial intelligence project back then. It was called the 5th Generation Project. And science fiction authors such as William Gibson, who coined the notion of cyberspace in the 1980s before the World Wide Web was created in Switzerland, here where I'm talking to you, such science fiction authors looked to Japan for inspiration. So this was the environment where both Kunihiko Fukushima and Alex Weibel did their work. Alex Weibel was an immigrant from Europe. And they worked there on what is now called CNNs. Interestingly, the Japanese 5th generation AI project was not at all about neural networks. It was about logic programming, mostly, essentially in the style of Kurt Gödel, the Austrian mathematician who in 1931 founded theoretical computer science by showing the limitations of theorem proving and computing in general. So Fukushima and Weibull were kind of outsiders back then, but at least there was sufficient funding in Japan for this type of research, and today the rest of the world can be thankful for that. Since 1989, the team of a French researcher named Yann LeCun has made additional important contributions to CNNs, especially for two-dimensional images. In 1993, Yuan Wang replaced Fukushima spatial averaging by something that is called max pooling, which is widely used today. With max pooling, a two-dimensional layer or array of unit activations is partitioned into smaller rectangular arrays, and each is replaced in a downsampling layer by the activation of its maximally active unit. So that's called max pooling, widely used today. My own labs in Germany and in Switzerland had nothing to do with the origins of CNNs. Instead, in the 1980s and 90s, we focused on the most powerful type of neural nets, on the recurrent neural nets to process sequential data. Think of text and speech and videos. And this has become successful. Business Week called our LSTM arguably the most commercial AI achievement. Recently, I learned that by the end of the 2010s, our 1997 LSTM paper, first author, my brilliant student, Sepp Hochreiter, got more citations per year than any other computer science paper of the 20th century. And in fact, since 2015, LSTM, trained by our CTC of 2006, first author Alex Graves, has done Google's greatly improved speech recognition on billions of smartphones, and our LSTM also was the core of the greatly improved Google Translate in 2016. In fact, by 2016, over a quarter of the awesome computational power for inference in all those Google data centers was used for LSTM. And Facebook announced in 2017 that they are using LSTM to translate 30 billion messages per week, or over 50,000 per second. Compare, the most popular YouTube video needed 2 years to achieve only 6 billion clicks. LSTM also learned to improve Microsoft software and Apple Siri and QuickType on billions of iPhones, and to create the answers for Amazon, Alexa, and the great companies from Asia, Samsung, Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei, and so on, are also using it a lot for automatic translation and so on. Since the end of the 2010s, however, a lot of natural language processing is done by transformers. For long input sequences, the efficiency was improved through linear transformers, whose core is actually formally equivalent to the fast-weight programmers that I published in 1991. 30 years ago. How do those fast-weight programmers work? A feed-forward network slowly learns by gradient descent to manipulate, to compute weight changes of a fast-weight network, and it computes fast weight changes through additive outer products of self-invented activation patterns. And today, often, this is now called keys and values for self-attention, terminology that I introduced in 1993. So that was the work we did, which was not at all about CNNs. In the 2000s, however, my team was also able to contribute something to Neocognitron-like CNNs, as introduced by Kunihiko Fukushima. In 2010, we first showed that unsupervised pre-training, something that I introduced in 1991 for deep learning, that unsupervised pre-training is not necessary to train deep neural nets with many layers, contrary to claims by a well-known researcher who said that nobody in their right mind would ever suggest this. And one reviewer called this a wake-up call to the machine learning community. And here we profited a lot from the exponential fall of computing costs. Since 1941, when Konrad Zuse built the first working program-controlled general-purpose computer, every 5 years, compute got 10 times cheaper. Zuse's machine could do about 1 elementary operation per second. Today, 80 years after Zuse, compute has become 10 million billion times cheaper. And so in 2011 came our deep and fast CNN, Neocognitron like CNN, called the DANet, named after my outstanding Romanian postdoc, Dan Claudiu Girejan, also known as Dan Girejan. In 2021, we are celebrating its 10-year anniversary. So it's a very nice coincidence that here in 2021, I can talk about Kunihiko Fukushima's pioneering work in the context of this accelerated version of what he did back then. And DANet was the first pure deep convolutional neural network to win computer vision contests in 2011. For a while, DANet enjoyed a monopoly. From 2011 to 2012, it won every single computer vision contest it entered, winning 4 of them in a row, driven by a very fast implementation based on graphics processing units, GPUs. Since 2011, DANet has attracted tremendous interest from industry. Its temporary monopoly on winning computer vision competitions made it the first deep CNN to win a Chinese handwriting recognition competition in May 2011, a traffic sign recognition contest in August 2011, and the first image segmentation contest in May 2012, and a contest on object detection in large images in September 2012. And the latter was actually a medical imaging contest on cancer detection. That was the first time that a CNN won a medical imaging contest also. And our CNN-based image scanners were 1,000 times faster than previous methods. The significance of these kind of improvements for the healthcare sector is obvious. Today, IBM, Siemens, Google, everybody, many startups are pursuing this approach. Remarkably, already in 2011, DANet achieved the first superhuman performance in a vision challenge in 2011, although compute was still 100 times more expensive than today. DANet was 3 times better than the runner-up, which was the net by Dr. LeCun's team. In July 2012, our CVPR paper on DANet hit the computer vision community and the similar AlexNet, citing DANet, joined the CNN party in December 2012. Our even much deeper HighwayNet of May 2015 and its special case ResNet, the residual net, of December 2015 further improved the performance. HighwayNets have hundreds of layers, not just tens of layers, but really hundreds of layers. And a ResNet is a HighwayNet whose gates are always open. Today, a decade after the DANet, everybody is using fast, deep CNNs with the architecture of Kunihiko Fukushima for computer vision. In sum, the now widely used convolutional neural network architecture is an essential ingredient of deep learning, and it's essentially the baby of Kunihiko Fukushima. I am personally greatly indebted to his work. Finally, I should mention something. The nominators of Kunihiko Fukushima asked me for a support letter. I told them that I might have a conflict of interest because I was told that I'll get nominated for this award myself. The nominators did not mind though, and so I was happy to write a glowing letter for Kunihiko, because it's clear that Kunihiko Fukushima totally deserves this award. Congrats and many thanks again to Kunihiko Fukushima. We are all looking up to him.
Okay. That was indeed outstanding, as I see in the chat, and I should mention, of course, that the caliber of the nominees was tremendous, as expected, and the international committee had a very hard time of choosing one Bauer awardee. We don't have the luxury of the Nobel Award prize that could go to more than one, or other awards at Franklin Institute. Very much appreciate Jürgen Schmidhuber for this brilliant talk, as well as participation in the selection process as well. Our next speaker is Tommaso Poggio from MIT. He is also well known, of course, in the community, and I could intimidate that he has also been, of course, very much involved in the selection process of the Bauer Award, but he does talk about his own work at MIT in 1970s and how he came to realize that a lot of what he has discovered has been previously actually done it's been also done by Dr. Fukushima. Tommaso Poggio is a physicist, and his research has always been between brains and computers. He is now focused on the mathematics of deep learning and on computational neuroscience of the visual cortex. He is the Eugene McDermott Professor in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT, where he directs the NSF Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines. Among other awards that he has received in 2014 is the Swartz Prize for Theoretical and Computational Neuroscience, and IEEE 2017 Israel Rosenfeld Lifetime Achievement Award. He is a former corporate fellow of Thinking Machines Corporation, a former director of PhD Capital Partners Incorporated, and of a number of other startups and high-tech companies. Tommaso Poggio's talk is presented.
I'm Tommaso Poggio, and I would like to thank Ken Abend and the Bauer Award Committee for its very wise choice in selecting a very deserving winner, Kunihiko Fukushima. With Yuval and Wiesel, he really started the deep learning field. And more to the point, he started it at the intersection of computer science and neuroscience, where I believe the greatest promises are. Today, I'll speak about the field of the science and engineering of intelligence. I'll speak about the science of intelligence. I think intelligence is not only one of the great problems in science, but I think personally the greatest of all. Question is, where are the big problems? And I'll go through these 4 points. First, some of the recent success stories in AI and machine learning. One is DeepMind, which is now part of Google, and the other is Mobileye, which is now part of Intel. They are also the success stories of two of my postdocs, Demis Hassabis and Amnon Sashur. And of course, I'm very proud of both of them. Now, the first story shows that machine learning can play games like chess and Go and be better than human champions at them. And so AI is beating humans in the virtual world of games. The second, Mobileye, shows that machine learning can do tasks that trained humans do in the real world, like driving a car. Now, if you ask what are at the core of these two success stories, there are two basic algorithms, two recent breakthroughs. One is reinforcement learning, and the other one is deep learning, that of course is started with Fukushima Neocognitron. Let me say a few words more about deep learning. Deep learning has an interesting mathematical puzzles. There are more parameters than training data. Despite that, there is the ability of generalizing to new data without overfitting. For some of you, this may look strange, but deep learning was an accidental discovery that did not have a theory until now. It has based in neuroscience, Fukushima Neocognitron, but not on mathematics. That's not unusual in science. Electricity was effectively discovered by Alessandro Volta in 1800, accidentally, but it took more than 50 years before Maxwell developed a theory which unleashed the full power of electricity. Given the audience interests, which are broad, I don't want to spend much time on what is a rather technical issue. I'll just state some of the recent theoretical results in our group. There are related ones in the field that essentially give some basic characterization of convergence of deep networks of stochastic gradient descent under the square loss training and why they generalize and other properties of the solution, including a phenomenon called neural collapse recently found by David Dono and co-workers. But you should not read this slide. I'm just shown this to point out that there is a theory developing around deep learning. And having said that, I want to go to the next slide, which is about what are the big questions in the field in terms of the problem of intelligence. Clearly, there are many questions, and this is because intelligence, like the science of life, which is biology, is not really one problem, but it's many problems, and so there are many questions. The first one is really that we are still far from understanding human intelligence and creating machines that reproduce human intelligence. We are still very far from it. AlphaZero, by DeepMind, plays superhuman chess and superhuman Go, but will not notice at all if the building is in fire. AlphaZero is like one of us with advanced Alzheimer, unable to survive without 24/7 care. How are we going to solve the problem of intelligence then? Where are the next breakthroughs going to happen? And if you ask me, I'll say that several of them will probably come from neuroscience. And the reason I say this is because the two past recent breakthroughs came from neuroscience. Reinforcement learning and deep learning, I already mentioned them, and deep learning came from Fukushima Neocognitron, which came itself from Hubel and Wiesel work in the visual system of monkeys. And this is the reason why a few years ago, we started the Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines between MIT, Harvard, Rockefeller, Johns Hopkins. I'm the director of it. It's dedicated to the study of intelligence, trying to exploit the synergies between cognitive science, machine learning, and computational neuroscience. Okay, next question is about neuroscience. In which sense can deep learning make us understand how cortex, in particular visual cortex, works? And here, one has to say that we are still at the level, basically, of the Neocognitron. And models like HMAX were essentially a somewhat more refined, more biologically faithful Neocognitron. And this deep learning model are essentially the same. The only added things is stochastic gradient descent for training the weights. And this shows that if you optimize the weights, you can get very good results. But it does not tell us how the brain does that. SGD or backpropagation is quite unlikely to be biologically plausible. Something else is needed. Okay, so despite this, there are critical predictions that come from the theory that has grown around deep networks from the Neocognitron on. One is about relating the eccentricity dependence of receptive fields in the retina and the primary visual cortex to scale invariance. The linear increase with eccentricity of the size of receptive fields reflects what you should do if you want to get a size invariant vision. And the theory also predicts that vision in cortex should start with a range of resolution. It's like having in the order of 5 or so different images, each one 40 by 40 pixels, but looking at the visual world at different resolutions, so with small and larger receptive fields, but 40 by 40, so to cover from a fovea around 26 minutes of arc to something like 6 minutes of arc, a fovea. That's an interesting prediction that still has to be verified, and that leads to models that are different from the ones used today. Another prediction about the fact that the architecture, if it's hierarchically local, so cells that look at a small number of cells in the layer below, it has several advantages for certain compositional tasks, as you can find often in vision, text understanding, and speech. And it also predicts that this hierarchical locality of the connectivity should be genetically determined, because with the theoretical results saying it cannot be learned from a reasonable number of examples. But whereas the weight sharing, the fact that you have the same weights at different positions, is learned from can be learned from visual experience, and probably during the first months of life, during which looking at a small number of objects like toys of a babies in the crib, transforming, rotating, moving, translating, are enough to gain scale and position invariant for any object. Also, we can say something about approximate invariance to transformations of object classes, for instance, faces or characters or bodies, in order to get invariant to not just scale and translation, but say rotation in depth, changes of expression, then the system, for instance, the visual system of a growing baby, have to see a few faces, say rotating in depth, and from that to be approximately invariant to the same transformation on new faces, not seen before. And this learning should happen over a longer time scale, so probably in childhood instead of babyhood, and it should affect later parts of the visual stream, so like V4 and IT. This part of the theory also predicts specific domain-specific regions, like the fusiform face area or the body area, in order to get approximate invariance to class-specific transformations. And we have some evidence that if you simulate what happens when you use a version of Hebb rule as a learning rule, then you get approximate invariance to rotation in depth of faces, and you get as an intermediate representation neurons in the model that are tuned to mirror symmetric head orientations. If they're fire for a view, they also fire for the mirror symmetric view. And this is what is found in recordings, was found in recordings by Doris Zhao and Rick Freiwald in the patch system in the monkey sensitive to faces. So, what comes next? Well, the next question is really, what are the circuits of intelligence? What I mean is, what are the circuits underlying uniquely human aspects of intelligence, like language and mathematics? It is tempting to assume that evolution at some point learned how to learn to develop circuits for reflexes, like escape reflexes. Perhaps just one synapse between sensory inputs and motor outputs. And then later extended this in associative networks, one layer or more layer. Networks that can associate an input xi to an output yi. Such a network was proposed in the 60s by Longe, Higgins, and Wilshaw. And it's an associative memory. And it's actually very similar to feed-forward deep networks and to kernel machines. They're all basically associative memories, associative lookup table. In the case of kernel machines, you have a network. If you use the kernel, say a Gaussian, your output will be the superposition of Gaussian, each one centered at one of the training examples xi. If you give an xi and your Gaussian is very narrow, then you get out a yi. It's really a lookup table. If it's not very narrow, then it will give an output even if the x you are doing is not one of the xi, but is close enough to several of the xi. So RBF networks and Wilshire networks and deep networks are basically interpolating associative memories. That's in perspective. I'll come back to that later. And so the question is, can associative memories, lookup table, explain high-level human intelligence? It's almost certainly no. So what did evolution discover beyond associative memories, beyond feed-forward networks? The obvious thing, not the only possibility, is that it discovered two things. One is recurrence, and the other is hidden states. So recurrence of the input-output and recurrence of this hidden state. If you have this, you basically have, coupled with a lookup table or an associative memory, you have a Turing machine. So universally powerful in the computational sense. So this is what evolution may have discovered. This is what may underlie human ability. There are a number of questions associated with this conjecture. Can we learn from data the lookup table in such a scheme? And in general, the answer is no. So how did evolution do that? And so on and so forth. We can, for instance, ask whether we can explain the intelligence of a honeybee in terms of a feed-forward network, a wish associative memory, or whether we need a Turing machine. And we can ask whether language was key in the discovery of human intelligence or just one of its main results. I think that the challenge for neuroscience is to find out which circuits underlie our intelligence, where they are, how they are different with respect to deep networks. I regard this as the core problem in our present quest to understand human intelligence and replicate human intelligence in machines. So, in summary, I spoke about AI and the emergence of a theory for deep learning. I told you that understanding and replicating intelligence will require several breakthroughs, and that my bet is that at least some of them will come from neuroscience, from the science of human intelligence. And finally, I told you that it may be a good idea, in order to understand which neural circuits underlie our intelligence, to reconstruct how evolution may have evolved beyond associative reflexes and associative memories. Thank you.
Okay, let's see. There are some questions.
Yes, there are some questions, but meanwhile, I just want to acknowledge that Professor Poggio is now live with us. And if we can probably, within interest of time, if there are any quick questions, since the speaker is here, we would appreciate hearing that.
Okay, there are 6 of them listed.
But they're related to the previous ones.
Oh,
so.
that's previous, so, okay.
But
I think one of those previous ones is relevant to what Tommasio is talking about as well, though, and that's the issue of top-down mechanisms. So, in other words, more active than passive reasoning, I think, is relevant to Tommaso's topic as well. So that's the one from Fo Sen Shaw about will, assertion of will in the process of reasoning, I think is equally relevant to Thomas's presentation.
so could you please state that to Tommaso, state the question to Tommaso, maybe he can.
The question on his face tells me he's following this quite clearly. So basically the idea of top-down and assertion active involvement in the learning process is what the questioner was inquiring about. And I think that that's pretty solidly in your wheelhouse as well.
Yeah. Okay, I can try to answer. I think this is consistent with what I was saying about recurrent connection. So you need both bottom up and top down. I think to explain human intelligence, at least the fact that we can deal with sequential in time, sequential computations required by language, by mathematics, by logics. And it seems obvious that we need at least the power of a Turing machine. Of course, there are a lot of technical difficulties, but in a sense, details in what I'm saying about equivalent to Turing machines. But it seems that, yes, from this point of view, you need both bottom-up and top-down connections. And of course, you'll find them in the brain, in all areas and parts of visual cortex and other parts of cortex in the brain, feed-forward and back projections, which are usually many more than the feed-forward connections. Of course, this may not be the answer, but I think it's part of the answer. The other question is top-down in the sense of addressing questions like consciousness. This may be the same question as intelligence, or maybe not. You know, it's I don't know what people think. Would a Turing test, designed to find out whether a person describes something inside a room as intelligent from discussing with it, would that definition of intelligence include consciousness or not? I have a number of friends who believe yes, and probably more that believe no. They believe conscious. You can have an intelligent machine which is not conscious, and maybe vice versa. That's an open question, but okay, that's a very special type of top-down, I think, and I prefer not to speculate about
it. In the interest of time, then thank you. And in the interest of time, let's, but Ken Abend will introduce our next speaker.
Don Wunsch is a distinguished professor and the director of the Applied Computational Intelligence Laboratory at Missouri University of Science and Technology. Key research contributions are in unsupervised and reinforcement learning and their applications. He's an IEEE Fellow, an International Neural Network Society Fellow and past president, a National Science Foundation Career Awardee, and the recipient of the 2015 INS Gabor Award and the 2019 Linda Lovelace Award. Dr. Donald Wunsch will discuss multidisciplinary innovation and our laureate.
Hi, I'm Donald Wunsch. I'd like to thank the Franklin Institute for this invitation and acknowledge the opportunities that have been provided by Missouri University of Science and Technology, the Mary Kay Finley Endowment, the National Science Foundation, and many other sponsors of this research. So we're celebrating the legacy of Kunihiko Fukushima, and I'm talking about some of the lessons learned from that legacy, and one of the most important ones is the value of multidisciplinary curiosity. So the upper left, we have a figure indicating the importance of multidisciplinary curiosity in neuroscience. That is a drawing by Simon Ramon de Cajal. That particular drawing is a hand illustration. You see, he wanted to be an artist. But the middle is about cognitive psychology, and the right is a vintage slide about electrical engineering, because when Professor Fukushima got his start, he was working in a research group that brought in experts from these three disciplines and had weekly seminars about the ideas from these disciplines, and they brought together this multidisciplinary curiosity. So even when you saw it within one individual, Cajal, who, as I mentioned, wanted to be an artist, decades later, you see this in his work that brought together these ideas and sparked this curiosity. But I threw in a book, The Idea of a University, which is a classic, which brought up this idea and said that the disciplines bring their contributions, they try to expand their boundaries. It has a lot of observations that are germane to this time in this field. For example, they talk, John Henry Newman spoke about the idea that a great contribution in a field will sometimes suppress the next percolation of ideas that come up. And so it's important to continue that curiosity regardless of what is the popular idea du jour. So the multidisciplinary curiosity and the courage to pursue that passion was really one of the basic ingredients that led Dr. Fukushima to his great accomplishments. And another thing that led him there was real problems. Dr. Fukushima started out in NHK research, and at the time in 1961, resources were not a huge advantage of the Japanese research enterprise. So around the time of 91, 30 years later, when I got my PhD, a lot of people were talking about competition from Japan and how rich they were and how much money they were spending on neural networks and AI. But in 1961, the situation was the opposite. So I'm grateful for Jürgen Schmidhuber for doing such a wonderful survey of the history of Dr. Fukushima's contributions, and he's done many similar surveys of important work in the field. So I won't replicate what he said, but I will just mention that in 1961, Dr. Fukushima was working on the problem of video data encoding in digital. And at that time, the technology was to put the digital data on paper tapes. So he was going from an analog recording, putting that data onto paper tapes, and then translating that data back up and recording it onto film back into analog. And so the ability to do faithful reproduction of that, you can imagine, is just a tremendous technical challenge for the day. And this did not stop him from attacking that really difficult problem. So the pictures here are current pictures of NHK Research Lab, and that's a snip that I took today from their website. And so they're still doing all these practical real-world problems, and it is not always about the resources. And I'll contradict myself about that a little bit later. I'm going to contradict myself deliberately a couple of times in this talk. But it's not always about the resources. So even bootstrapping, and much of his work was done alone or with a very small team. And so he did remarkable things, often on a shoestring. I'd like to continue about real problems and a little bit about where do we go from here. So the National Academy of Engineering of the United States issued 14 grand challenges for engineering in the 21st century. I'm not going to try to go over them all. So some of them are reverse engineering the brain. Actually, one of my pet peeves is to talk about the human brain. We do great if we reverse engineer a mouse brain or even an insect's brain. There's a lot of things that still need to be done that are far, far beneath the capability of a human brain until it's not. So some of the things that are real problems to attack now are problems that are even difficult for human brains. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. The upper right shows a figure of a memristor. So I think that memristors and similar non-volatile memory technology are a big important part of the research of where do we go from here, of getting neural networks even into cheap things, even throwaway devices, even having neural networks embedded into, for example, a disposable cup or that type of a thing. Very cheap and disposable technology will be made possible by non-volatile memory, which can encode inexpensive sensors and inexpensive machine learning devices. And that will just transform things in ways that we can't even imagine. Oh, for example, maybe smart paint. So a lot of things that are difficult to even imagine now. Right below that, also on the right, we have a fairly current figure of the Toyota Prius. And I just want to point out that a hybrid electric vehicle used to be a cutting-edge problem not that long ago. And the reason it was a cutting-edge problem is because the human better not need to pay attention when you're switching from gas to electrical power. And to be able to do that was a very important innovation not that long ago. And it really built up from ideas that were supported by the vision of the National Science Foundation and others about the importance of reinforcement learning. And so that was, without that, we wouldn't have a Tesla today. The market forces that were created by a successful introduction of a hybrid electric vehicle really changed the world. Swarms are an important technology. So Boeing supported some of my own research. And I mentioned earlier, I actually didn't say enough about it. I have it on my slide. Dissatisfaction is your friend if you do something about it. So being dissatisfied with the state of the art and wanting to move forward is really a very important thing that all the giants brought into the field, that Dr. Fukushima brought into his research, and that really was important in improving the state of the art of neural networks performing the traveling salesman problem, which is something that I worked on almost 20 years ago, and Boeing picked it up, and some of that resulted in patents as recently as last year. So the ability to change the behavior of a trajectory of collaborating robots in real time is an important challenge in order to get to the point where these swarms of electric vehicles can maybe cooperate to alleviate traffic, alleviate congestion, and at the same time make for a greener, better operating world. And smart grid is a similar challenge. So you have different types of energy that put challenges to the stability and smooth operation of the grid, as we saw recently in Texas. And looking for ways to mitigate all those challenges is really important. Real areas of dissatisfaction, but opportunities to move forward. And it's really important that our leaders pass along the passion. So Kunihiko Fukushima has been a wonderful exemplar of this throughout his time. I didn't have time to dredge up a bunch of the examples, but he's been coming to our conferences for years. And in this picture, he participated in a series of recordings of the IEEE Computational Intelligence Society History Committee to pass along what he's learned and keep that passion going. And we need that because we have some big needs in the field still for taking that dissatisfaction and turning it into a new contribution. So the Lifelong Learning Machine project of DARPA that is now in its phase 2. My project is called Mixed Modality Learning for Lifelong Learning Machines. Terry Sanowski was also supported by this program, and many other leading researchers are passing along some new innovations for keeping the machines learning and not just have human experts that train the machines and then toss them off the wall and let them fend for themselves. Explainable AI is another major area that needs a lot of work, and that has a connection to the important area of generative adversarial networks. Attentional mechanisms have gotten a lot of attention lately, and all types of attentional mechanisms really are going to be necessary to get us to the next steps. I wanted to take just a few moments, if you'd indulge me, to drill down with one example, and that is with cluster validation, because it's really critical to assess the quality of what has been learned. There's been a lot of talk about assessing the quality of machine learning. Some of it are ethical questions, some of it are performance-based questions, but nowhere is that more difficult than when you're doing unsupervised learning. So in the battle days, which was up until very recently, people did unsupervised learning like this: do unsupervised learning and then pray, because you don't see how well you're doing in real time. And offline validation is very slow. So you do the learning and later you look at measures of cluster validation. They're very important. They're a whole chapter in my book on the subject. And up until recently, that was all done after the fact. But, excuse me. But online assessment of learning is mandatory if you're going to do lifelong learning. If you're going to do any type of real-time analysis of streaming data, you need to know how you're doing. And so that means knowing how you're doing with regard to comparing correct partitions to over-partition or under-partition. So the lower half of the slide is showing over-partitions and under-partitions in clustering results. And so the important thing, and the paper that I'm talking about, this paper, is clustering algorithm agnostic, to say, well, what can you do to get better answers for how you're doing? And the way to do that, the classic way to do that, is with clustering validity indices. And there's a bunch of them. Here I'm drilling down on just one of them. It's not the most important one, but it's the simplest to understand. The numerator is just a distance between cluster centers, and the denominator is just a normalization that's based on summing up the distance between each point and a cluster center. And that index can let you know how well you're doing. And so they all are driven to trying to drive towards an extremum, either make them bigger or make them smaller. And what I just showed you was an offline version of it, but it's not difficult to convert this to an online version where, as you get a new point, you just update your estimate of that index and you show that you get to the same answer. And then you can, the paper I just showed you was just about introducing these as tools that are available for people working in the field. But what we've done more recently is look at using them to actually improve your clustering as you cluster. And so this paper is under review, but an archive version is out. And again, this is clustering algorithm agnostic, but we tried it with a particular algorithm and with several different incremental clustering validity indices. And what you get is equal or better clustering results, but much, much faster to get to the same answer. So up to 2 orders of magnitude faster. So anyway, returning to the contributions of Professor Fukushima, this picture is from his 1971 work as he was getting towards cognitron and later neocognitron, the work that he's recognized for now. And so despite limitations of the technology at the time, despite limitations of resources, and despite not having access to voluminous amounts of data or a huge research team, he moved forward courageously to do something about the research challenges that faced him at the time. If you'll indulge me for one more thing, I'd like to say something about this acknowledgement of his research today. It's a great celebration, to be sure, of some tremendous accomplishments that were setting the seeds for much later work that came along. Professor Fukushima did deep learning before most other people were thinking about anything like neural networks this deep. There were people that were already working on multi-layer neural networks, but not at the depth. Convolutional neural networks grew out from this type of work. And I would like to praise Jan LeCun for citing the work of Fukushima and talking about it in very favorable terms as his contributions have grown in visibility. And I'd like to cite this as a positive example. There's a lot of glory to go around. The field is just exploding with many opportunities for everyone and more opportunities than we can even imagine. So when I said earlier that a pet peeve was always talking about humans, part of what I was getting at is that we've got well over another century of progress to make. So in the lifetimes of even the grandchildren of the youngest people in the field, there will be many opportunities for people to continue to make great, giant contributions to the field. So there's plenty of glory to go around. I was at a conference where, well, I've been at many conferences where people have made priority claims, and I was at one where one of the giants in the field had a priority claim made against his work, and 2 speakers later he gave a talk. This was in 1990. They were both wonderful European contributors, both of them people I admire. And the second person who came up had neural nets frequently named after him, but he never tried to do that. It's just what people did. And when a priority claim was made about his work, he just said, I don't mind. You can say anything that you want about my work. Just please cite it. And I think that's a great example. If we take the time to cite the work, then people can make up their mind about what the contribution was. So we alert each other to the work in the field. And so I think it's understandable when people don't, people are juggling a lot of things to come up with their papers and their talks and their oversights. But I want to acknowledge some early contributions. So I'm going to back up just a little bit. To this slide, because I promised to contradict myself. I said real problems are important, but 2 of the problems on this slide are actually toy problems. I didn't talk about them yet, but they're really important toy problems. And that is StarCraft and Go. And so DeepMind basically solved both of these problems, not yet definitively with StarCraft, but really compellingly with Go. And it was really wonderful that they did that, and I'm thrilled at that contribution. And I want to say that Terry Sanowski got there first, He got there, I think, in the early 90s. He was the first person that I could find that published a paper that used reinforcement learning to attack Go by self-play. And then when I started attacking that problem in the late 90s, my group was the second to do reinforcement learning with self-play against Go, and the first to do human move filtering, so to look at massive databases of moves. And then Pierre Baldi got there a little bit later with a paper that he published that I actually coordinated the review of. And so there were some early contributions in the 90s and early 2000s. For me, fifth time was a charm. I had 4 proposals rejected before NSF funded a 5th one, and we tried to do that. But sometimes it is about resources. So solving Go basically was an investment of about $500 million to acquire the DeepMind company and then basically give them a blank check to solve that problem. That investment was well worth it because the market cap of Google went up by several $billion soon after those investments were made. Subsequently, they attacked the StarCraft problem, and they did amazing things with that. That is a real time. The players don't take turns, they just move. Very challenging problem. It has a lot to do with situational awareness. It's a tremendously challenging problem. I don't think it's more challenging than Go. It's a very different animal than Go. But so even games, sometimes things that look like toy problems are real problems. But I think a focus on real problems, and I think the interplay between academia and universities, academia and industry, is a really important aspect of research in this area. So anyway, I want to come back to this slide with the young Kunihiko Fukushima and his machine, and just point out that it really is about curiosity. It really is about multidisciplinary research. It's about taking your dissatisfaction and turning it into something positive. And it's really about what is next. What is next? Passing along the torch all the time. And so Dr. Fukushima is still a researcher. And so he sets a great example. There are several people in the field, several in this talk, in this symposium, and several people in the field who keep their passion going all the way through. And so Kunihiko-san, you've taught me many things, including the suffix san to indicate great respect and great affection. It is with tremendous affection that I offer you my fond congratulations, and you are extremely deserving of this award. Thank you.
Thank you.
Omedeto, Kunihiko-san, omedeto.
Thank you very much, Professor Wunsch, and I understand that you'll be joining NSF and as a program director. And as a matter of fact, since you did mention that you did 4 proposals to NSF before, the 5th one being accepted, I believe Paul Werbos not the person who, the program manager at NSF, who actually supported that.
Right. He made many seminal contributions to both backpropagation and reinforcement learning well before joining NSF, and he funded my first grant as an assistant professor. And if I'd had to try 5 times on that one, I probably wouldn't be here today. But it was the one on Go that I tried several different parts of NSF, and nobody believed my assertion that reinforcement learning was the right way to do it until Paul Werbos funded it. And so we made some progress, but the 300,000 was not enough to attack the game of Go. So it was very helpful to Paul to fund and enable some things. But For example, the Prius, my first PhD was a major contributor to the neuroengineering of that, and he was funded by Paul First when he was my student, and those ideas percolated their way. And I don't think that the Tesla company would be successful if the Prius had not been economically successful first. So we plant seeds is one of the messages, and I think I said in my talk, but there's plenty of glory to go around. You know, you plant a seed, you got a big, beautiful tree later, and there's a whole world of this forest of trees. So one of the really exciting things right now is that working in neural nets would be like working in physics if you had a lifetime of 6 centuries. Things are happening so fast in this field that it's like knowing Newton and Einstein and Maxwell and Planck and Leibniz. We are incredibly lucky, and so one of the congratulations, the word I said in Japanese was congratulations to Kunihiko-san. But I'd also like to congratulate all those who decided to attend today and those that come to the conferences, whether it's IJCNN or NeurIPS or ICML or whatever your favorite meeting is, because you know, when Picasso was sitting in the La Pina Jail, or when C.S. Lewis was sitting around talking to J.R.R. Tolkien, there were thousands of people just walking by on the street and not even noticing these people hanging around. But you're participating today. So I saw a lot of people I know. I saw Grace Huang, I saw Garibaldi in there, several other people and in the audience, and there's hundreds, can't mention them all. But you have chosen to walk with the giants. And Isaac Newton said, if I saw fire, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants. Well, I'm not going to claim I stood on the shoulders of some of these giants, but the view from the pocket here is pretty good too when you're working with the giants. So people like Kunihiko-san, Bernie Widrow, Paul Werbos, and you, Bahram, for that matter, have been along the walk with me for years, and we've benefited tremendously. So Bahram was the first to put some of these things integrated into an electronic chip together with machine vision to put the neurons right there. And, you know, Carver Mead took that idea and did some other things with it. But Bahram got certain aspects of that first. And so there's plenty of glory to go around. And in fact, at the very first IJCNN, it was Carver Mead who said, hey, you students out there, and you see these talks and they look so brilliant and everything, you got to realize all of this started as a kludge. Okay, everybody started as a student. Everybody started with kind of fumbling around and not yet knowing what they're doing. And so you see the emperors all around, but you know, every day they have no clothes sometimes too. So no matter how prominent a researcher is, they got there by going through that difficulty. That's why on my first slide, I said dissatisfaction is your friend, because you have to struggle. You have to go through the struggle. And there's still lots of things to be dissatisfied about, a lot of things to solve. So for example, I saw a question in the chat about what are the key challenges to lifelong learning? Well, one of them is this idea of stability versus plasticity. That's also been given many other names, the idea of your learning working its way out of things that you knew, and you learn your way into something new and you forget the old stuff. So that is an enormous challenge that there are some answers to, but still a lot of horizons. So your grandchildren of the youngest members of this audience could have a long and healthy career in this field. We're not about to be overtaken by machines. So anyway, there are more questions, but I'll let us move along, and thank you all very much. And Congratulations again, Kunihiko-san.
Thank you, Don. The next, the final talk of the symposium is also by one of the people who has been historically involved in great contributions to the field, well known, Terry Sanofsky. He received his PhD in physics from Princeton University, was a postdoc at Harvard, and then at the faculty of Johns Hopkins. And he holds Francis Crick Chair at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, as also a distinguished professor at the University of California, San Diego. He is the co-director of the Institute for Neural Computation, is the president of the Neural Information Processing Systems, NIPS, and he is the editor-in-chief of Neural Computation. He was truly a pioneer in neural networks and in computational neuroscience. He co-invented the Boltzmann machine, as many of you know, already mentioned, Boltzmann machine with Geoffrey Hinton, and developed independent component analysis, a machine learning algorithm for blind source separation of mixed signals. He is, of course, published over 500 scientific papers, 12 books. He has new books also in computational brain and on deep learning revolution. Terry Sanofsky is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the National Academy of Medicine, and the National Academy of Inventors. I believe that there are less than a dozen people alive who are members of all four national academies. Anyway, this is his talk for the symposium.
Hi, my name is Terry Sanofsky. I'm here at the Salk Institute for Biological Sciences in La Jolla. And I'm here today to celebrate the 2021 Bauer Award to Kunihiko Fukushima for his creating the Neocognitron in 1980, for conceiving it and really thinking about the far-reaching consequences. Now, the story begins, of all places, in the physiology lab. And I'm going to take you through a little bit of history that preceded the work that Kunihiko was inspired by. And this is work that was done in the visual system, specifically in the lab of Steve Kuffler. I was a postdoc in his lab back in the 80s, and I got to know him very well because I did experiments with him every day. Now, back in 1953, when Steve was at the Johns Hopkins University, he did a classic experiment which was technically very difficult. He recorded from single ganglion cells in the cat retina and in vivo, and reported that they responded very well to spots of light. Now, this was an extraordinarily difficult experiment. He had to do the fine recording from single neurons and also be able to adjust a spot. I once asked him why he did this experiment, because he was more famous for doing physiology experiments. He was a master at being able to understand how neurons communicated with each other at synapses. And he told me that, well, he was in a department of ophthalmology and he felt guilty that he wasn't working on vision. So he decided to do this experiment. And then he said, well, you know, let's follow the signal downstream. And he gave this project to two of his postdocs, David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel, and they discovered in primary visual cortex that rather than responding to spots, that the best stimulus was an oriented bar or edge. And the tuning was different for different neurons in the visual cortex. And furthermore, there were different kinds of cells, simple cells that just had simple receptive fields, the region which when you stimulate it gave you a response, and then complex cells that were able to respond over a wider region, but still oriented. And finally, hypercomplex cells, and there's a hierarchy. And of course, this was the inspiration for the Neocognitron. And here it is. Here's the Neocognitron that we see that Kunihiko proposed in the 1980s based on the architecture of the visual cortex. Now, unfortunately, it took 30 years before his conception was actually made into a practical device. And that's shown here. This was now work that was done by Jan LeCun, the convolutional neural network, which really mirrored the hierarchy in the visual cortex, and every stage in it, you know, the simple cells, the complex cells that were pooling, and the nonlinear transitions that occurred in the units. That was all based really from Kunihiko's original model. Now, what was remarkable was, as you can see here, in recordings from the visual cortex of the monkey by Jim DiCarlo, that if you look at the properties of the neurons at every stage, that there were parallels. That is to say, for the very same visual stimulus that you gave the monkey and to the convolutional neural network, the statistical properties at every stage matched between these two networks, suggesting that despite the fact that the learning algorithms that were developed to train these networks was very different from the biological ones, that nonetheless they converged to the same system of hierarchy for being able to create invariances to position, scale, orientation, and also, as you can see here, at the final stage, being able to categorize images. Now, the big jump of 30 years, I think, can be explained by one major influence, major engineering achievement, which was the Moore's Law. Now, back in the 1980s, computers were very slow. In fact, when we were working on this, the VAX had about a million operations, a megahertz, million operations per second. And it was cheaper to write a program to try to solve a problem than to try to use brute force computing. And of course, with time, the programs got larger and larger and more expensive. And eventually, in computer vision, it became a point where the cost of computing had reduced to the point where learning algorithms were actually competitive. And in fact, in 2012, I can tell you the exact moment because I was there at a neural information processing systems conference in Lake Tahoe. Jeffrey Hinton and his graduate students reported unprecedented performance on ImageNet, which is a data set consisting of 20,000 categories and over 220 million images, and reduced the error rate by 20%, which is typically about 1% per year in computer vision. So he jumped 20 years into the future with that one network, AlexNet. And of course, since then, the cost of computing has continued to go down, and these performance, of course, has gone up. And we're now living in a completely different era. And this is really a consequence of computing becoming cheaper and cheaper. Now, I'm not going to be focusing on practical applications, but I think it's just worth going over this list because it really, I think, is impressive. In addition to high levels of performance in visual object recognition, similar performance has been achieved in speech recognition. If you go to your cell phone and you speak into it, it will transcribe it for you. And this is speaker independent. This is a real achievement. Now, these are both based on supervised learning. That's to say, large labeled data set. and using a learning algorithm like backpropagation. But another approach, which was based on unsupervised learning, generative adversarial networks, has created a way to generate images, photorealistic images that are indistinguishable from real images of people, of rooms, of objects, and so forth. And this is telling us that the representational capacity of these networks is extremely high. But I think the most dramatic applications have been in the area of natural language processing. And one of the holy grails in artificial intelligence has been language translation. And now, again, there's an app on your cell phone that allows you to do translations. I was in China a few years ago, and I was trying to order a ham sandwich, a room service, and we didn't have a common language, but through the cell phone, we were able to translate back and forth from English to Chinese, and sure enough, I got my ham sandwich. So this is really something that I would have never imagined when I was first beginning back in the 1980s that it could reach that point, which, by the way, is back then it was science fiction. It was what Star Trek had, the universal translator, but we now have it. And even larger language models have been developed. I'm not going to go into the details except saying that GPT-3 by OpenAI has reached 175 billion parameters, and there's one that just came out recently from Google with 1 trillion parameters. So, the computation marches on. And finally, I think one of the most dramatic applications has been to games. And now we have deep learning networks coupled with reinforcement learning algorithms that can play chess and Go at superhuman levels, and including poker, which is a game of imperfect knowledge because of hidden information. And in order to play poker at the world-class level, you need to be able to bluff. And now deep learning networks have learned to bluff and beat the best poker players, which suggests that these deep learning networks are world-class liars, which of course causes one to pause. Now, a couple of years ago, the National Academy of Sciences organized a meeting on the science of deep learning. It was organized by mathematicians, and it was based on the fact that these deep learning networks, according to the mathematical knowledge that existed in statistics and optimization theory and other areas of mathematics, according to the traditional views of experts in those fields, deep learning shouldn't work. It was a paradox that we were able to get these networks to teach them to do anything because of the large number of parameters and the very complex optimization that needed to be done to get them to work. And it was pointed out to us that convex optimization, which of course is a problem that has been really advanced by optimization theorists, is the problem there is to find the global optimal solution to a problem. And if it's convex, you have an opportunity to go downhill, say with gradient descent or even more sophisticated ways to get that solution. But with the loss functions that we had in our networks back in the 80s, it was clear that there were all these local minima. And the question was, why is it that when we got stuck in local minima, we found good solutions? And it's really an interesting irony that it turns out that the problem, there was really a different one from the one that the optimization theorists are trying to solve. They're trying to find the global optimum. Well, it turns out that each of these local optima at the very end of learning was a pretty good solution. So it really transformed the problem from finding a needle in a haystack to a haystack of needles. There's just, an infinite number of networks that have comparable performance, near comparable performance. And so that was part of the reason. The other part has to do with the high dimensionality of the space. So as you come down and are reducing the loss, there are singularities. And most, as you can see, were saddle points. And why is that? Well, if you have a billion dimensional network with 1 billion parameters, the probability that all of them are going up is infinitesimal. There's always going to be a way to go down at the saddle point. And I think this is what saves us when we're doing these very large scale optimization problems. Now, the other thing that was very fortunate back then was that we used stochastic gradient descent. We used small batches. We didn't update by going through the entire training set all at once. We did it in small batches. And of course, that meant that the downhill directions that you picked were stochastic, but more or less going in the right direction, compared to a much more efficient algorithm that would take you there faster, but not necessarily better. And we suspect that, unfortunately, you know, if you use these other methods, you don't get good solutions. So we suspect that by having stochastic descent, we were able to explore a larger part of the space. Again, there's a lot of work that needs to be done here, the optimization theory, to understand what's really going on in high dimensional spaces. And finally, and this is where we were back in the 1980s, and this is what the statisticians were telling us, is that, you know, if you have a training set and a test set, and as you reduce the error of the training set, at some point you're overfitting and the test set performance goes up. And we were able to use early stopping in order to be able to get good solutions, but it was very interesting that as the computing got faster and more data became available, that we went into a completely new modern regime where even after the training error goes to zero, it's possible to continue to reduce the error on the test set. And this is something that Tommy Poggio has studied in great detail, and I'm sure you've already heard about this. But there's still a lot of paradoxes that need to be explored. And this is, I think, telling us that the high dimensional spaces have properties that we just are counterintuitive. And this takes me to a book that was published in 1884 called Flatland. And this is a book written by Edwin Abbott, narrated by a square who lived in a two-dimensional universe. And he one day had a dream that there was another dimension. And he dreamed about a sphere that, when it intersected, would be a circle. And of course, it was the king of Flatland was a circle. He was just a square. Well, he couldn't convince anybody else and eventually went to an insane asylum. Well, I think we are living in Spaceland, which is three-dimensional. We have a similar problem with intuition. Now, I'm going to spend the rest of this talk not talking about practical applications in the real world, which are many, but rather the impact that deep learning is having on science. And there are many, many applications in many areas of science. I'm just going to pick 3 of them that I think are particularly important. And here I'm going to start with super resolution microscopy, which is a technique that has revolutionized optical microscopy. Another very, very classic problem, holy grail, is protein folding, predicting the 3-dimensional structure of proteins from their primary amino acid sequences. And then finally, a real world problem. Well, how is it that birds are able to soar up thermals? And this is a problem we'd like to be able to understand. Okay, starting with super resolution microscopy. Here on the left is a field of view of little, as you can see, test particles that are nanometer in scale. You know, they're fluorescent, so you can see them. And this is with a confocal microscope, which is found in many labs, which has a diffraction limit about a micron, or a little bit less than a micron. And here is a super resolution microscope, costs millions of dollars, and it allows you, using tricks, to get down to on the order of 1/10 of a micron. Well, we would like to be able to use the confocal microscope to give us images like this on the right. And here are 3 spots that are shown here, blown up. And you can see that in the super resolution, they can be resolved into nearby points, but in the confocal, they're blurred. Now, in deep learning, you need to have a training set, and here we have it. We have the input from the confocal and the output from the ground truth from the super resolution. And now we can train it up. And when we do that, here is a test image that's never seen before. And we can see that it is able to resolve these peaks that are close to each other. How did it do that? How did it go from here and extract out this information? Well, this is the magic of deep learning. And somehow it's encrypted. The information is encrypted and is able to pull it out. Now, what this means is that every lab with a confocal microscope doesn't have to spend millions of dollars. It just has to use an accelerator, you know, a program that has already been trained from deep learning, and it's very fast and very efficient. Now, that same trick can be used for electron microscopy, and I'm going to quickly show something here from Uri Manor, a colleague of mine here at the Salk. Again, here is the high-resolution EM image. This is a cross-section through the brain, and this is a synapse. And in the presynaptic axonal terminal, you can see there are these vesicles. Now, if you only collect a brief period of time, this requires a long time of collecting electrons, electron microscopy. But if you only look at a very brief period of time, the resolution isn't not nearly as good. And as you can see here, this is focusing on a single vesicle. It's really impossible to make out what's really there, or very difficult. But again, if you do the trick of training on pairs of the input and the ground truth output, what you get is a result which is remarkable again. And what this means is that you can vastly speed up the rate at which you can take images. And this is very important in the field of connectomics, which is the reconstruction of the entire wiring diagram, which at the present is about a cubic millimeter, contains about 1 billion synapses. But within the next 10 years, we're going to be able to do that, taking advantage of tricks like this for the whole mouse brain, which has 100 billion neurons. I'm sorry, that's the human brain, 100 million neurons in the mouse brain. Protein folding, it was considered computationally infeasible using traditional methods. Here's the problem. You have amino acid sequences, and we have millions of them from genetic sequencing. And we know that there's a secondary structure. There's a helix and a sheet, and this then folds up in 3 dimensions. And it's the 3-dimensional surface with the binding pockets that you need in order to be able to tell the function of the actual protein. Now, the brute force way is molecular dynamics, where you simulate the forces between the amino acids, steric hindrance, and so forth. But unfortunately, it takes an enormous amount of computation, using femtosecond time steps, so that even to go a nanosecond requires an enormous supercomputer to go for days. And so the question is there a different approach? Is this an insoluble problem? Is it something that we have to wait for computers to get faster? And the answer is no. And this was already apparent back in the 1980s, even with our small networks. This is a paper that was published in Journal of Molecular Biology by Ning Chen, a graduate student in my lab, in which we applied a neural network to the problem of predicting the secondary structure. If we can predict the helix and the sheet, perhaps we could make progress with the tertiary structure too. And to make a long story short, here's the architecture. We had a window of 7 amino acids, and the goal with 1 layer of hidden units is to predict the secondary structure of the middle amino acid. And as you can see, as the network was using ground truth from X-ray crystallographic structures, this at the time in the Brookhaven database had several hundred, we were able to actually get performance that was much better than existing programs that depended on the biophysical properties of the amino acids, like the hydrophobicity and electrostatic charge. Now, fast forward, again, that was back in the 80s. 30 years later, computers have gotten 1 million times faster. There's a contest that runs amongst the community of people who are trying to write algorithms for protein folding. And as you can see, over a period of about 10 years, where they tried to predict the structure of a protein whose structure was known but hadn't been released yet. But they were stuck at about, as you can see here, a 30 on this scale, where 90 was considered equivalent to the crystallographic structure. AlphaFold was a program that was created by DeepMind in London, which, as you can see, in 2018 improved from about 30% up to about 60%, and then just last year very close to 90%. This is astonishing. This is so far beyond anything anybody in biophysics or even in deep learning could have ever predicted. This is have enormous impact up the road on biological structures and understanding the function of proteins. And finally, I'm going to tell you about a project that was done in my lab, collaborating with a group in the physics department at UCSD. And it has to do with the fact that birds can soar. They can, in this case, you're going to see a falcon. It's been instrumented with a GPS, so we can see where it goes, and also whether it goes down, which is blue, or up, which is yellow and orange. So let's see what it's trying to do. It's trying to find a thermal. It's flying over terrain. It's going up, and here it starts looping. It senses something in the atmosphere, and this is a characteristic thermal kind of a pattern, a helix. It's going to the left because there's a horizontal velocity, and without that, it would go straight up. So this is remarkable. So what is it that the bird is actually doing? We don't know. We'd have to instrument the bird, and we have to come up with a very detailed physical model. But there's another approach, which is to try to simulate a bird and apply optimization techniques. And in this particular case, we applied a reinforcement learning algorithm called temporal difference learning. And I won't go into the details except to say that the algorithm simulates an agent which is getting input from the environment, various properties of the velocity, acceleration, temperature, and so forth. And also the reward here is the height. And the goal is to try to increase the height by taking actions. And this can be done through trial and error, practice, practice, practice. And the way it does that is by creating a value function. The value function tells you the likelihood that this state will allow you to go up. And it's updated on the basis of what's called reward prediction error. It means that you predict what the value is, whether you're going to go up or down, and then you, on the next step, see whether you go up or down, and the difference is used to update the value function. And this was an algorithm developed by Rich Sutton back in 1988. Now, it turns out that this algorithm is a good model for a particular part of the brain called the basal ganglia. And in 1996, Reid Montague and Peter Dayan, who were my postdocs in my lab at the time, suggested that the dopamine neurons that project very broadly into the basal ganglia, which is important for learning sequences of actions to achieve a goal, a reward, and they project deeply, not just and widely to the basal ganglia, but also to the prefrontal cortex and other parts of the cortex. That in fact, perhaps the signal that they were projecting was the reward prediction error. And in fact, now this has been confirmed many times, both in monkeys and in humans. And this seems to be a basis for human learning through reinforcement learning through practice. Now, the remarkable event occurred in 2017 when AlphaGo, a program that again was developed by DeepMind, beat the world champion Ke in Go. And this was unprecedented because of the fact that up to this point, Go programs could play at best at a midland amateur level, very poor compared to these very high level Go players, especially in China, Korea, and Japan. And of course, Ke didn't really take this very seriously, but he lost 3 games to none. And it wasn't just losing the games. AlphaGo created moves that no human had ever even thought of before, that it was playing a different level. It wasn't, if it was a human playing it, you would say that this was a very creative human being. And here's what Ke said after losing. And by the way, losing face in Asia really is a serious event. After humanity spent thousands of years improving our tactics, computers tell us that humans are completely wrong. Well, this had a huge impact in Asia because there Go isn't just a game; it's really an sort of a artistic and very high level human achievement. Okay, well, in order to make progress on thermals, we're going to apply reinforcement learning to find an optimal set of actions. And we're going to start with a simulation using Rayleigh-Benard convection equations as shown here. And this is what they look like. It's very turbulent. As you can see, the vertical flow, here's a snapshot, is very, here's going up in red and down in blue. And you can see that it's very fragmented in the temperature field as well. And that makes it very difficult to come up with anything that is going to be, because it's changing from moment to moment. It's very, very turbulent. So here's what we did. We came up with a simulation of an agent in this turbulent environment. And we had sensors, temperature, angle of attack. Of course, that's whether you're going up or down, and vertical velocity, gradients across the wing, rate of climb, vertical acceleration. And this was in collaboration with Massimo Vergasola at UCSD, and Gautam Reddy was the graduate student who did a lot of these simulations. And so here is at the beginning on the left, you can see it's trial and error, and it's going down, 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 blue. But after a lot of training, you can see it's beginning to develop a strategy for going up. And we can do more than this. We can also go in and find out what were the features, what were the sensors that were providing the performance. And temperature, which everyone thought was the key variable, it has absolutely no impact. If we just look at them individually, there's only two that really were significant. One was the vertical acceleration, which is not too surprising, but then the velocity, vertical velocity gradient across the wing. And if you combine them, you got as good as you can ever get. And you don't, angle of attack, adding the angle of attack or the temperature had no improvement. So this is really telling us something that can be tested in birds. But you know, this is a simulation. I wouldn't trust it because the real world is much more complex. So Gautam teamed up with a club. It's a hobby here to have model airplanes that can soar with radio control. And here's a 6-foot wingspan that Gautam instrumented with sensors, and also a miniature, as you can see, system here for doing the reinforcement learning. And he, you know, simply let the system, let this, you know, kept flying these gliders over and over again until they finally were able to get off the ground, so to speak. And this shows, this is a real glider now, and you can see that it's going down, down, down. And this is after a week of training. It's beginning to get the idea, and so there's some progress here. So here's Gautam sitting in Poway, which is north of San Diego. And now the club is going out and they're trying to compete with each other. Who can get their glider to go highest with their radio control? And so Gautam, these are launched by catapult, and then you can control it. So Gautam launches his glider and then sets the control down and sits down, and everybody looks at him and says, "Are you crazy?" And what happens? The glider finds a thermal and it starts going up, and it loops the way that birds do. And at 600 meters, 1,800 feet, it loses radio control. And everybody is looking up at the glider and looking down at him. He has his arms crossed. What's going on here? And what this illustrates is that in a real world setting, if you have a learning algorithm that is powerful enough to be able to access enough data and be able to try and practice long enough, you can actually achieve things that weren't really appreciated or understood. And of course, humans glide too. And if you ask a glider, how do you do it? They can't tell you, because the reinforcement learning is not, it's part of the brain that's not accessible to consciousness. But you know, they get better and better. And one glider once told me that I look for birds because they seem to know more than we do about how to find these thermals. Now, I've published a book, Deep Learning Revolution, which goes into some of these, you know, what's really might be happening, both in terms of practical applications, but also in terms of the future, looking toward what the impact is going to be on many aspects of our society and in science. And the tagline, as you can see at the top, is that artificial intelligence meets human intelligence. And I think that's really the big theme here in the book, which is that by going to a model which is more based on a biologically inspired architecture, we can actually go back and forth between advances in understanding the brain, and with the Brain Initiative, that's accelerating. We can now record from 1 million neurons at the same time. And as we learn more about the brain, that can then inform our learning algorithms and the architectures that are used in deep learning. Now, the Turing Prize is the highest honor that a computer scientist give, and in 2018 it was awarded to Jan LeCun who developed convolutional neural networks, Geoffrey Hinton, who inspired a generation of research in neural networks, including my collaboration with him, and Yoshua Bengio, who really was fantastic in developing new architectures like the generative adversarial network and applications to language. And this is really quite an honor for them to be singled out this way. But we really owe Kunihiko Fukushima a debt of gratitude, because he saw farther than we did back in the 1980s. And I want to end with a personal tribute. I want to really thank Kunihiko-san for the inspiration he gave me at the beginning of my career, because I too was inspired by Hubel and Wiesel's landmark recordings in the visual cortex. I was at Harvard Neurobiology with them. I got to know them personally, and I was really inspired. But the proposal, Kunihiko's proposal for the Neocognitron, which was based on their findings, gave me hope that someday we would understand vision through computational models. Well, that day has come. Kunihiko, your day has come. Thank you for your far-reaching vision of the future.
That is a wonderful conclusion to the presentations of our symposium. We would like to thank, Ken and I would like to thank all the presenters and for their wonderful talks. It is now actually 1:30 a.m. Japan time, so I'm not sure we should expect Fukushima-san to be present at this late hour or not. And Terry Sanofsky, by the way, had another meeting to attend to that started at 12 noon our time, so is not able to be here at this point, even though his final remarks were quite suitable for concluding this session. I would like to sort of, if there are any final thoughts, brief thoughts that any of the presenters would like to share, this would be the time to do it.
It's just a wonderful day for all of us. I already mentioned how we're like walking with centuries worth of giants because of the speed of progress in the field of neural networks. But it didn't start out with the low barriers to entry that we have now. So Kunihiko-san, it's wonderful to see that you're still with us. Arigato, you have done so much for all of us.
Thank you very much.
think. Dr. Fukushima, unless you have something to say, we can conclude our symposium.
I thank all speakers today for sparing your valuable time for this symposium. And I didn't have enough time to speak to all topics on the Neocognitron. So if you're interested in the Neocognitron, please refer to this paper. Let's see. This paper explains more detailed, gives more detailed explanation of the Neocognitron.
Please leave it up there. Don't take it away. I'm going to make a snip of it, and I'm sure that the other audience members want to grab it too. Oh, would you put it back up?
It's still here.
Oh, okay.
Command Shift.
Yeah, I see it. I got it. Command Shift. Okay, go ahead.
Command Shift. Okay. Excellent. Okay.
And may I speak a little bit? Jürgen Schmidt-Huber said, why CNN started in Japan? So I'd like to tell something about it. In 1960s, I was working for MHK. As Don Bush told in his speech, I was working for MHK. MHK stands for Japan Broadcasting Corporation. And in 1965, MHK started Science Research Laboratory independently from Technical Research Laboratory. And one of the aim of the Science Research Laboratory was to understand the mechanism of the brain, because MHK send auditory and visual information through radio and TV. So one of the aim of the Science Research Laboratory was to understand the mechanism of the brain, final destination of auditory and visual information. So at that time, I was very much interested in modeling neural networks in the brain, not for AI itself, because AI at that time was took the quite different approach from now. It used the if-then rule, and it's not so the same as the AI today. So in order to understand the mechanism of the brain, we worked together with neurophysiologists and psychologists together in the same group. So it was nice for me to understand the mechanism of the brain, and I was very much interested in modeling neural network in the brain. So I think it's important to know the mechanism of the brain to improve the AI in the future. Thank you very much.
This meeting is recorded, and you will all receive the link to the recorded meeting. Once again, on behalf of myself, Ken Abend, the cluster of the electrical engineering cluster of the Committee of the Science and the Arts of Franklin Institute. I would very much like to thank everyone for their participation. All the speakers were in the from the very beginning of the Bauer Award were very extremely involved, including since that Jürgen has already mentioned it, being both nominated at the same time, providing a fantastic letter of recommendation. Everyone was, it is a testament to the business of the field. And it has been for us also an honor to be able to recognize what all of you have done. So with that, thank you very much again, and we will see you soon. And I'm sure that we will hear about all of your work, continue to hear about all of your work. Thank you again.
Thank you for the organizer for this great workshop.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Byron. Thank you so much.
Yeah, magnificent. It's great to see you.
Same here. I'll see more of you, I'm sure. Okay, take care.